Welcome everyone to tonight's Talmud class. Tonight I would like to analyze and contemplate together with you the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Specifically, who is obligated in the mitzvah, in the commandment, to study the Torah, and how does one go about fulfilling that commandment? Are there specific guidelines for learning Torah? Do the rabbis give us a learning program that's structured for us? Exactly how do we go about fulfilling this mitzvah, which the rabbis tell us is keneged kulam, equal to all of the 613 commandments? First of all, I'd like to discuss with you the question of who is obligated to study Torah. I'd like to first draw your attention to the Rambam, to Maimonides, one of the greatest codifiers of Jewish law in all of Jewish history, who writes in his magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, which parenthetically discusses all of the various laws that were culled from the Talmud, Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi, from all of the rabbinic writings going back to Moses himself. The Rambam describes in the laws of Talmud Torah, the commandment to study the Torah, as follows. Kol ish mi Yisrael, every Jewish male, chayav b'Talmud Torah, is obligated in the mitzvah to study Torah. Bein ani, bein ashir, whether he is poor or whether he is rich. Bein shalem begufo, whether he is complete in his body, in other words, whether he is healthy. Bein bal yisurin, or whether he is a person who suffers, either physically or perhaps mentally. He undergoes challenges and suffering in his life. Bein bachor, bein shahaya zaken gadol shetashash kocho, whether he is a youth, whether he is young and full of energy, or whether he is of advanced age and has no energy left. Afilu haya ani hamit parnes min hatzedaka, even a poor person who is dependent upon charity, umechazer al petachim, and he has to go from door to door to collect funds for himself and his family, even such a person is obligated in the daily study of Torah. Va'afilu bal isha ubanim, and finally, the last person on this list, on this top 10 list, so to speak, of people who are obligated in the mitzvah of learning Torah, is a man who is married and has a family. Chayav likboa lozman, even such a person and all of the people in this list are obligated to establish and set aside time every single day, bayom uvalayla, in the day and in the night, to study Torah, the Talmud Torah. Shnei Amar, as it says in a verse in the book of Yehoshua, Perek Aleph, Pasuk Chet, the first chapter, the 8th verse, V'yigita bo yomam v'layla, that one should be engaged in the study of Torah for day and night. And we'll discuss in a little while the implications of that verse, that one must make time both in the day and in the night to study Torah. But before we go any further, I'd like to just address one question, and that is, why does the Rambam Maimonides make the point of saying Kol ish mi Yisrael, that every male is obligated in the mitzvah to study Torah? What about women? Are women exempt from this mitzvah? Are women not required to make time in their daily schedules for the study of Torah? In fact, we know that women are also obligated to study Torah. The rabbinic literature writes that women must be thoroughly familiar with all of the mitzvot, with all of the laws. If you don't make time to study the laws, then you will certainly be unable to fulfill those laws. Furthermore, women and everyone, every individual, is obligated to be familiar with the ethical teachings of the Torah and of Judaism. So, even though this is not tonight's topic, since the Rambam does allude to this, I will just mention that there is a distinction between the commandment for men to study Torah and the commandment for women to study Torah. That although every Jewish person must be thoroughly familiar with the basics of Torah, with the Bible, with Tanakh, with the ethical values and teachings of the Torah, and certainly with the mitzvot, with the knowledge of how to fulfill the commandments, because as I said, if you don't study how to fulfill the commandments, you will be unable to fulfill the mitzvot. Nevertheless, there is a distinction between the obligation of a man and a woman in this mitzvah of Talmud Torah. The Beit Halevi, for example, Rav Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, the original Rabbi Yosef Dov Halevi Soloveitchik, writes in one of his books that the obligation of a man to study Torah is even including those aspects of the Torah that do not give us specific instruction for how to fulfill mitzvot, or do not give us specific ethical instructions. In other words, a man has an obligation to study Torah lishma, purely and simply for the sake of studying, whereas women have a much more objective-oriented obligation to study Torah. Their obligation is to study Torah in order to know how to fulfill the mitzvot and how to create and strengthen a family that is permeated with the values and ethics of the Torah. But again, that's not the topic for tonight's discussion. The topic is who is obligated, what type of person is obligated in this mitzvah, and how do they go about fulfilling that mitzvah. To answer this question, we have to look at the original source, the source that ultimately is quoted or becomes the origin for a statement of the Rambam in later on in his Laws of Talmud Torah. That source is the Gemara, the Talmud in Masechet Yuma, Daf Lamed Hey Amid Bet 35b, which, going off on a tangent, has a discussion about individuals who are obligated, or perhaps obligate others, as we'll see in a moment, to study Torah. The Talmud relates as follows. Tanu Rabbanan quotes a Braita, a source taught by the rabbinic sages, the Amoraim, Ani v'ashir v'rasha ba'in ladin. All different types of people, after they leave this world, after they pass away, they come for judgment. Wealthy people, wicked people, poor people, they come for judgment. La'ani omrim, to a person who is poor, he is asked, omrim lo, they say to him, the heavenly tribunal says to such a person, mipnei ma lo asakta batorah. Why did you not make time for the study of Torah during your life? Im omer ani hayiti tarud b'mezonotai. If the poor man will say, I was too busy struggling to make a living, and therefore I was unable to make time for the daily study of Torah, omrim lo, the heavenly tribunal will respond to such a person, klum ani hayita yoter mi Hillel, were you poorer than the sage Hillel? And there's a whole story about Hillel that the Gemara now relates, that the Talmud now tells us. Amru alav, they said about Hillel, al Hillel, hazakin shebechol yom vayom, every single day, haya ose umistaker bitrapik. He would go out to his job. If I'm not mistaken, I believe he was a wood chopper. He was a sage, he was a great rabbi, but every person needs to do something to make a living. And in those days, as in our days, rabbis were not the most wealthiest profession. So Hillel Hazakin, the great Hillel, the elder, the first Hillel of many rabbis named Hillel, he would go out and earn his wages. He would earn a very small amount of money called a trupik. What did he do with that trupik? Chetzio haya noten l'shomer beit hamidrash. He would use half of his daily income to pay the fee, the entrance fee, in order to go to the yeshiva. In those days there was a fee, or I guess you can call it a tuition, that people had to pay in order to go to study in the Beit Midrash. Half of his daily wages would be spent in order to enter the Beit Midrash, v'chetzio leparnasato uleparnasat anshe beito. And the other half of his daily wages were used to pay for his personal living expenses and those of his family. Pa'am achat lo matzah lihistaker. One day Hillel Hazakin went out to work, but he was unable to find work that day. V'lo hinichu shomer beit hamidrash lihikanes. When he went to the yeshiva, when he went to the Beit Midrash, the guard would not grant him access to enter the yeshiva. After all, he didn't have the necessary money to pay the entrance fee. So what did Hillel Hazakin do? He wasn't going to miss out on even one day of learning Torah. Allah v'nitla, he went up to the roof of the yeshiva, and tradition has it that there was a skylight of some sort on top of the yeshiva, on top of the roof. Vayashav al pi aruba kedei sheyishma divrei elukim chayim. And he went up to listen by the window. He went to hear the words of the living God. In other words, he wanted to hear the words of Torah, mipi Shemaya va'av talyon, from the mouth of the leading rabbinic sages of the time, Shemaya and Avtalyon. Amru oto, they said, oto hayom, that day, Erev Shabbat haya, it was Friday, utekufat tevet haita, it was the winter months, The month of Tevet falls out in the wintertime. It's the month where traditionally there is the most rainfall and perhaps snow. Vayarad alav sheleg min hashamayim. There was snow that descended from the heavens and covered Hillel Hazakim. Kisha'ala amud hashachar, when dawn arose in the morning, Amru lo Shemaya va'Avtalyon. The two leading rabbis, Shemaya and Avtalyon, entered the Beit Midrash, and they noticed that something was different that morning. Shemaya said to Avtalyon, Avtalyon achi, my brother Avtalyon, v'chol yom habayit me'ir. Every single day, the Beit Midrash, the yeshiva, is illuminated by the light from the skylight. V'hayom afel. Today, the yeshiva is dark. Shema yom ha'me'unanhu. Perhaps it's a cloudy day, and that's why it's not dark outside, and that's why the sun is not coming in through the skylight. Hitzitzu einehen. They raised their eyes, ura'u, and they saw demut adam ba'aruba. They saw the image of a man in the skylight. Alu, they went up to the roof. Umatsu alav, and they found on him, on Hillel, rum shalosh amot sheleg, 3 amot. An amma is approximately 1.5 feet. It's the distance from the edge of one's fingers until his elbow. They found 3 amot of snow covering Hillel. Parkuhu, v'harchitzuhu, v'sichuhu, v'hoshivuhu keneged hamedura. They brought Hillel down. They saved him. They brought him into the yeshiva. They washed him off. They anointed him. They brought him near the fire so he can warm up. And essentially, they saved his life from hypothermia or from being stuck in the elements. Amru, and they said, Ra'ui zeh lechala alav et Shabbat. This individual is worthy that we should desecrate the Shabbat on his behalf. Of course, what they're referring to is the fact that he was Moser Nefesh. He was literally giving his all in order to have the opportunity to study Torah, not to miss Torah for even one day. And this actually raises an interesting question that I don't want to discuss now, but we always have to think about questions and ideas that come up as we study, and that is, the halacha is, one is not only permitted, but obligated to violate the Shabbat, to desecrate the Shabbat in order to save any person's life. Why does Shemaya and Avtalyon say that Hillel was worthy of having, that they should desecrate Shabbat to save his life, if in fact anybody who is in mortal danger is worthy that others should desecrate the Shabbat to save such a person's life? I'm not going to answer that question now, but just something to think about in the back of your head. In any event, the point is clear, that when a poor person goes up, when an ani goes up to Shemayim after his time on this world, and the heavenly tribunal, the heavenly court, asks him, why did you not make time for the daily study of Torah? When such an individual says, I was busy trying to eke together a living, the answer, the response of the heavenly tribunal is, were you as poor as Hillel, who in spite of his poverty, and in spite of the fact that he struggled mightily to earn the barest, most minimal wages on a daily basis, nevertheless he made time for the daily study of Torah. Why did you not do the same? The Gemara then continues, and it tells us as follows, Ashir, when a wealthy person goes up to the heavenly court, Omrim lo, they ask him the same question. Mipnei ma lo asakta b'Torah. Why did you not make time for the daily study of Torah? And what if his response is as follows? Im omer ashir hayiti. If he says, I was a wealthy man, v'torah hayiti b'nechasai, and I was busy with all of my properties, with all of my businesses, the answer, the response of the heavenly tribunal is, Omrim lo, klum ashir hayita yoter mi Rabbi Elazar. Were you wealthier than the rabbinic sage, the Talmudic rabbi, Rabbi Elazar? Amru alav Rabbi Elazar ben Charsum. They said about Rabbi Elazar ben Charsum, legend had it, that Sheheniach lo aviv, his father bequeathed to him, his father left for him, Elef ayarot, 1,000 cities, bayabasha, on the dry land, ukenegdan elef sefinot bayam, and corresponding to these 1,000 cities on dry land, these 1,000 properties, or perhaps more than properties, actual cities that were inhabited by people and businesses. In addition to those 1,000 cities, he had 1,000 ships, 1,000 boats at sea. Uvechol yom vayom, and every single day, what did Rabbi Elazar do? Notel nod shel kemach, he took a flask of flour, he took a container of flour, al ktefo, on his shoulder, umahalech me'ir la'ir, and he would travel from one city to another city, medina lemedina, and from one province to another province, lilmod Torah, in order to study Torah. Pa'am achat, one time, mitza'u avadav, his servants that were left for him discovered him, ve'asu bo angarya, and they started to give him a difficult time. Amar lehen, he said to them, bevakasha mikem, I request from you, hanichuni, leave me alone. Ve'elech lilmod Torah, and I will be able to go and study Torah. Amru lo, chayai Rabbi Elazar ben Charsum, she'en manichin otach, umiyamav lo halach, ure'ei otach, ela yoshiv osik b'Torah kol hayom kol halayla. Essentially, the Talmud concludes for us that this Rabbi Elazar, even though he had a multitude of businesses and properties and ships and every reason to be busy with earning his money and with maintaining his wealth, nevertheless, his primary focus in life was not his wealth management, but it was his dedication to the daily study of Torah. And so therefore, even a wealthy person has this requirement to make daily Torah study part of his life. The Gemara then continues and tells us, what about a person who's a rasha? What about such an individual who's a wicked individual? What about his dedication to the study of Torah? And the Gemara concludes that people who have opportunities to chase after physical pleasures and sins, so Yosef HaTzadik, the great biblical figure Yosef, who had every opportunity to sin and overcame his desires, that person is mechayev, he obligates those who also have similar opportunities. So the Gemara makes it very clear that all these various people are obligated to make Torah study a priority in their life. The Talmud similarly in Masechet Kiddushin, Daf Lamed Amid Aleph, goes on to describe our obligation to study Torah. But before we get to that passage in Masechet Kiddushin, let's first take a look at a passage in Bava Metzia. I'm not going to read it inside in the text itself for the sake of time, but in that passage, the Talmud asks the question not about poor and rich people, but about healthy people or people who, God forbid, are not healthy. And the Talmud tells us about rabbinic figures who were not physically healthy, and nevertheless, in spite of their physical challenges and ailments, made Torah study a priority in their lives. Now I'd like to switch gears, since we've established that every single person is obligated to study Torah and to make Torah study an integral part of their daily schedule. The Talmud tells us in Masechet Kiddushin the following interesting information about how one is able to make this goal fulfilled. Now, we pointed out just a moment ago that a person is obligated to study Torah every single day of his life, regardless of his situation. Those who are healthy, God forbid those who are not healthy. Those who are wealthy, and those, God forbid, who are poor. Those who are old and those who are young. Those who are busy and those who are not busy. Everyone has an obligation to study Torah every day of his life. Now, I don't want to get back into this topic, but just to mention again, both men and women have an obligation to study Torah. There is, according to the Beit HaLevi, a distinction in the type of Torah study that one is obligated to engage himself or herself in, but men and women have an obligation to connect themselves to God through the study of Torah. So how does one exactly fulfill this goal? The Talmud tells us, the Gemara relates in Masechet Kiddushin, Daf Lamed Amid Aleph, the following statement. Amar Rav Safra Mishum Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya. Rav Safra related in the name of Rabbi Yoshua ben Chananya, Mai Tichtiv. What does it mean in the verse in Sefer Devarim Perek Vav, the 6th chapter of the book of Devarim, one that we're all familiar with? It's taken or is recited twice on a daily basis in the Shema. We say, Vishinantam Levanecha. There's a responsibility to teach our children the Torah. The word for teach, to teach, is an unusual word, Vishinantam, not the typical word Velimadatem otam, which actually appears in the second paragraph of the Shema. So the Talmud tells us, Vishinantam al tikre vishinantam, don't read it in the literal sense as vishinantam, ella vishilashtam, that there's an allusion here to the way that we fulfill the mitzvah of Torah study, which is vishilashtam. You must divide the Torah into 3 segments. That is a very interesting statement. Where does the Talmud get this idea from, that we have to divide our Torah study into 3 segments? Well, we'll get to that in just a moment. But before we analyze that question, let's finish off this line in the Gemara. The Gemara says, how do you divide the Torah into 3 segments? La'olam yishalish adam shenotav shalish b'mikra, shalish b'mishnah, shalish b'talmud. A person should occupy himself in the study of Torah in 3 facets, or 3 aspects. The aspect of studying Mikra, which refers to the Bible, the 24 books of the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, the 5 books of the Chumash, or the 5 books of the Torah, Bereshit, Shemot, Vayikra, Bamidbar, Devarim, which were dictated word for word by God to Moshe and written down according to those instructions. And then the remaining books of Nach, of Nevi'im and Ketuvim, the books of the prophets and the writings of the prophets and leaders of the Jewish people during the prophetic era. So a person must spend 1/3 of his time, or 1/3 of his Torah study, focusing on Mikra, on the Jewish Bible. Shlish b'mishnah, another third of one's focus of Torah study must be on Mishnah. Mishnah is the most concise record of the oral tradition of how the Torah is to be understood and transmitted. The story, and this is not the platform for discussing the story, but I'll just tell it very quickly. Al regal achat, on 1 foot, so to speak. The story is told that the Jewish people had taught the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral traditions, the oral explanation of the Torah, by word of mouth, from teacher to student, teacher to student, teacher to student, for many, many generations. From the time of Moshe Rabbeinu himself, of Moses, until the time of the Roman conquest of the land of Israel. It was during that time that one of the most famous rabbis, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, Rabbi Judah the Prince, also referred to by the name Rabbeinu HaKadosh, our holy rabbi, or simply Rebbe. It was during this time that Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi decided, due to the Roman persecution, in which rabbis were publicly executed for teaching Torah, it is essential that the oral tradition, which was never written down for the purpose of being taught, it was essential that now, in that generation, the Torah must be written down. However, since one is not really supposed to write down the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition, Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi wrote it down in the most concise form possible, and that is the Mishnah. So one should spend another third of his focus on Torah study being involved in the study of Mishnah. And the third, which is referred to as Talmud, is the intricacies of the Mishnah, the discussions and debates, the nuances, the origins of the laws, where the laws come from, and things that we can infer from these sources. Essentially, arriving at the halacha l'ma'aseh, the actual conclusion, and how one is supposed to conduct himself or herself. The question, though, is, how did the Gemara come to this conclusion, that the word vishinantam actually is an allusion to an obligation to split our focus of Torah study into 3 components? It seems to be a rather strange law or idea to derive from the word vishinantam. Rashi, our most important and famous of commentaries on the Talmud, tells us vishilashtam, quoting the idea that you have to divide your Torah study into 3 parts. He says, Midilo k'tiv vishanitam. Since it didn't say the word that would have been more appropriate according to Hebrew grammar, vishanitam, and it uses a different word, vishinantam, we derive from here a nuance in this law, shalisham, that you must divide your Torah study into 3 components, which are the ones that the Talmud tells us about. But the question then becomes, how does one practically do this? How do we divide our time, our Torah study, into a focus on 3 separate sections? One on the Bible, one on the oral tradition, and one on the nuances and discussions and debates and, bottom line, practical halacha, practical law, how do we divide our focus onto these three things? I'd like to share with you three different opinions now, which will bring us to our conclusion for tonight, and the bottom line of how one practically is able to make a learning program to succeed at learning the various parts of the Torah. The first opinion is that of Rashi. Rashi tells us on the spot, again, Daf Lamed Amid Aleph, the 30th page of Masechet Kiddushin, Rashi says on the word liyome. Well, actually, before we read Rashi, let's take a look at the next line of the Talmud, of the Gemara. Mi yodea kama chayai. How can a person divide his focus of Torah study into three segments? Nobody knows how long he'll live for. Maybe he'll live to be 100 years old. Maybe he won't. So how do you divide your life focus of Torah study into three different segments? And the Gemara answers, lo, it doesn't mean that you should spend 1/3 of your life studying the Bible, the Tanakh, and 1/3 studying Mishnah, and 1/3 studying Talmud, the debates and discussions and conclusions, but rather liyome, lo tzricha liyome. We rather need to tell you this to instruct you on how to study Torah on a daily basis. And Rashi says, what does this mean, liyome? That on a daily basis you should divide your learning into three segments. So Rashi says, Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, Yemei HaShavua, the days of the week. You shall spend 2 days of the week involved in the study of Tanakh, 2 days of the week involved in the study of Mishnah, and 2 days a week involved in the study of Talmud, or the halacha. I guess on Shabbat you have a day off, or a day to review all of the Torah study that you were engaged with all week long. That's the opinion of Rashi. We divide our week into groups of 2, 2, and 2. However, the Baalei Tosfot, many of whom were Rashi's grandsons, disagreed with this opinion, and they say as follows. Perush b'kuntris. Kuntris is a reference to Rashi. Rashi tells us in his pamphlet, in his commentary to the Talmud, Yemei HaShabbat, that the way that we divide our Torah study into three segments is by dividing our weekly study of Torah into days of 2, 2, and 2, as we mentioned before. Klomar, Shnei Yamim Mikra, Ushnei Yamim Mishnah, Ushnei Yamim Gemara. We spend 2 days studying the Tanakh, and 2 days studying the Mishnah, and 2 days studying the Talmud, or Gemara. Velo Nihira, the Tosfot said that doesn't exactly make 100% sense to us. Diim Kain, Akati Havam Matze, the Mifrach, you could still ask the question that the Gemara asks, Mi Yada Kama Chayai. Nobody knows how long he'll live for. Nobody knows how to plan out his life. A person won't get an equal amount of Torah, of Tanakh, and Mishnah, and Gemara if he follows this system of dividing his time, even on a weekly basis, into these three segments. So there must be a different answer, a different interpretation. The Nirali, Tosfot offers another possibility. L'faresh b'chol yom v'yom atzmo yishalesh. A person should divide every day when he sits down to make time for the study of Torah into three parts. In other words, when you study Torah every day, you should make sure to study some Torah from Tanakh, some Torah from Mishnah, and some Torah from Gemara. Al Kain, and he makes an interesting observation, therefore, Tikein b'sidur Rav Amram Gaon, amongst the earliest Sidurim, prayer books that we have, which was written by Rav Amram Gaon, we find Sha'anu Noagim B'chol Yom Kodem Psukei Zimra, before the introductory recitation of the Psalms, which prepares us for prayer. Rav Amram Gaon includes various components of Torah study. Among them is a section from Tanakh, a section from Mishnah, and a section from Talmud, from the Gemara, and in this way, every single day incorporated into the prayers is an opportunity for studying each of these three components of Torah. However, there's another approach here. Rabbeinu Tam, who was Rashi's grandson, and one of the most famous of the Tosfot rabbis, he tells us, Piresh, he explains, Sha'anu somchin ahad aminan beSanhedrin. This is a very novel and interesting idea. The Talmud in Sanhedrin tells us, why is the Babylonian Talmud, the sages, the rabbis who lived in Bavel in Babylonia, and expounded upon the Mishnah and explained the Mishnah and recorded for us what the oral tradition and oral law is, and incidentally is the basis for our halachic system nowadays. Why is that Talmud referred to as Bavel? Because Belula, B'Mikra, B'Mishnah, B'Gemara. It's a hodgepodge. It's a mixture of quotations from the Tanakh, from the Mishnah, and from the Gemara. In other words, the Gemara at Bavel, Balul Mikulam. The Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Bavli, includes aspects of all three components of Torah. And therefore, according to Rabbeinu Tam, in order to fulfill this idea from Masechet Kiddushin, that you have to divide your Torah study into three parts, it would be sufficient simply to learn the Talmud Bavli, not to spend time learning Tanakh and not to spend time learning Mishnah, but just to learn Talmud Bavli would be able to accomplish that obligation. However, this is not so simple. We mentioned already the opinion of Rashi. One should divide the days of the week into Tanakh, Mikra, Mishnah, Gemara. We mentioned the opinion of Tosfot that one should divide his daily schedule into three. We mentioned the opinion of Rabbeinu Tam that one simply has to learn the Talmud Bavli. The Rambam, Maimonides, takes a similar approach to the first opinion found in Tosfot, and he says as follows: Ad Emat, this is in Hilchot Talmud Torah, the laws of Torah study, Perek Aleph, the first chapter, Halacha Yud Aleph through Halacha Yud Bet, paragraphs 11 and 12. Rambam records, Ad Matai Chayav Adam Lilmod Torah, until when is a person obligated to study Torah? And this is a good synopsis of everything that we mentioned in the beginning of our class tonight. Shnei Amar, Ad Yom Moto. Person has to study Torah until his last day. Shnei Amar, Ufen Yasuru Milvavcha. Person has to be careful lest he turn away from his heart. The Torah should not turn away from his heart. Kol Yimei Chayecha, all the days of your life. The Kol Zaman Shelo Yasok B'Limud, the Rambam then adds, every moment that a person does not obligate himself or involve himself in the study of Torah, Hu Shocheach. When we take a major break from the study of Torah, we begin to forget what the Torah says. And then the Rambam, now perhaps quoting our Gemara in Masachet Kiddushin, tells us, V'chayav l'shalish et ziman l'midato. A person has to divide his learning into three parts. Shalish b'Torah shebichtav, 1/3 of his Torah study should be involved in the study of Tanakh. V'shalish b'Torah shebal peh, another third should be studying the oral traditions of Torah shebal peh, what we refer to as Mishnah. V'shlish, and the other third, the last third, Yavin v'yaskil acharit davar mereshito. You have to understand the origins of the laws, where they come from. V'yotzi davar midavar. You can extrapolate one law from another law. V'yadam davar ledavar, and compare one law to another law in order to derive new nuances in the halacha. V'yadin b'midot shehatorah nidreshet behen, and you're able to use the halachic system that was passed down to us from Moshe Rabbeinu. Ad shiyada he'achu ikar hamidot v'he'ach yotzi ha'asor v'hamutar v'chayotze behen midvarim shalamad mipi hashmua, until you're able to learn that which is permissible and not permissible, essentially until you can reach expertise in the study of Torah and reaching halachic conclusions. V'inyan zeh hu hanikra Talmud. This is referred to as the study of Talmud. And then the Rambam goes even further, again quoting from the sources that we mentioned earlier. Hayabal umanut, if a person is a worker, if he has a trade, or if he has a skill, yihya osik b'melacha shalosh sha'ot bayom. This is the opposite of what we do nowadays at best. The Rambam says you should work for 3 hours every single day. Ubat Torah teisha. If there are 12 hours in the day, and you spend 3 of those 12 hours working, you have 9 hours left. So what do you do with those 9 hours? You divide them. This is easy enough math. 9 divided by 3 is 3, 3, and 3. Otana teisha, those 9 hours you divide as follows. Korei b'shalosh mehen b'torah shebichtav. 3 of those 9 hours you spend involved in the study of Tanakh. Uv'shalosh b'torah shebal peh. Another 3 hours are involved in the study of Mishnah. Uv'shalosh, and the last 3 hours, mitbonin b'da'ato lahavin davar midavar. The last 3 hours you're involved in Talmud, in other words, learning and deriving the intricacies of the laws. V'divrei Kabbalah b'chlal Torah shebichtav hein, the words of the prophets, the Nevi'im, are included in Torah shebichtav. U'perushan b'chlal Torah Sheba'al Peh, but the explanations of the prophetic writings are included in the oral tradition in the Torah Sheba'al Peh. So where does this bring us practically? With three different opinions on how one can fulfill the obligation to study Torah on a daily basis. And as we said in the beginning, everyone is required to study Torah on a daily basis. How does one fulfill this obligation? The Shulchan Aruch records as follows. Chayav Adam l'shalosh limudo. A person is obligated to divide his learning of Torah into three. Shalish b'Torah, shebichtav. This sounds like a straight quotation from the Rambam. 1/3 of a person's Torah study should be focusing on Tanakh, Dahainu ha'arba ve'esrim. This refers to the 24 books of the Bible. Shlish b'Mishnah, another third of one's time and focus should be spent studying the Mishnah, Dahainu Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the most concise written record of the oral tradition. Upirush Torah shebichtav bichlal zeh, and included in Torah Sheba'al Peh is the explanation of the written Torah. And finally, Shlish b'Talmud. The remaining third should be spent on Talmud study. Dahainu sheyavin v'yaskil acharit davar mereshito. This is an exact quotation from Maimonides. You have to be able to understand the origins of the laws and v'yotzi davar mitoch davar, to compare the laws to each other, to understand the precedence of the halacha, v'yadamed davar ledavar, and be able to compare one case to another, v'yadun b'mirot she'atorah nidreshet bahem, and be able to extrapolate laws and ideas in the traditional way and the only way that the Torah can be interpreted. Ad sheyeda heach ikar hamitzvot v'heach yotzei ha'asor v'hamutar, until you know the primacy of the laws and what's permissible and what's not permissible, etc. And then again, the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, written by Rav Yosef Karo, quotes from Maimonides this whole statement about dividing the hours of our day. If a person works for 3 hours and he has 9 hours left, he should spend the remaining amount of time dividing it equally into the study of Tanakh, of Mikra, the study of Mishnah, and the Torah, and the study of Torah, and the study of Talmud. But then the Shulchan Aruch says as follows: when does this apply? In the beginning of a person's study of Torah, when he's younger. When a person reaches proficiency in all of these aspects of Torah, he already has mastered the Tanakh, the Bible, the Jewish Bible, and he's mastered the Mishnah, the oral tradition. What should he do with his time that he has for the study of Torah? Yikra ba'itim mizumanim Torah shebichtav v'divrei Torah sheba'al peh. Once in a while, he should study these things, Tanakh and Mishnah. V'lo la'asok tamid b'Torah v'lo yehi tzarich lilmod Torah shebichtav v'lo la'asok tamid b'Torah sheba'al peh. Once he achieves mastery in these aspects, he doesn't need to spend his time studying these things, but rather he should focus on Talmud. However, the Shulchan Aruch does point out, once in a while you should go back and review the Tanakh and the Mishnayot. Now we have here the opinion of the Ramah of Moshe Isserlis, who is the Ashkenazic authority, quotes whenever the halacha or minhag differs, whenever the custom differs from the Shulchan Aruch, and he says, V'yesh omrim, there are those who say, Talmud Bavli, shehu balul b'mikra b'mishnah v'gemara. There are those who say that studying the Babylonian Talmud, which includes a taste of Tanakh and Mishnah and Gemara, Adam yotzei yedei chovato, a person discharges his obligation to study the 3 elements of Torah simply by studying the Talmud Bavli. Bishvil hakol, a person is able to accomplish all of these obligations through simply studying the Talmud Bavli. Ve'ein la'adam lilmod ki mikra Mishnah Gemara v'aposkim hanimshachim achareihem u'vazeh yikneh ha'olam hazeh u'va'olam haba. He gives advice here. He says if a person spends his time studying Mikra, Mishnah, Gemara, the Tanakh, the Mishnah, the Talmud, and the halachic writings, then ultimately he acquires for himself life in this world and life in the next world. So where does this leave us at the end of our class tonight? Ultimately, a person has to make his best effort to achieve mastery and at least proficiency, in all of the different areas of Torah. The 24 books of the Tanakh, of Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, the books of the Chumash, the books of the prophets, the books of the prophetic writings. He has to learn Mishnah, the concise, or most concisely written book of Torah Shebaal Peh, of the oral tradition. And a person has to make time for the study of Talmud, which analyzes, discusses, and debates the intricacies of all of these laws, their origins, and their precedents, what we can learn and derive from them. I'll just, however, conclude with 2 more points, and that is that it says in Pirkei Avot that a person has a whole hierarchy of when he is supposed to start learning different parts of the Torah. It says in Pirkei Avot, Chamesh L'Mikra, when a person turns 5, he begins to study the Tanakh for 5 years until he's 10. Presumably by the age of 10 he has mastered the entire Tanakh. At the age of 10, Eser L'Mishnah, he begins to study Mishnah. At the age of 13, he begins to study the laws. Now that he's turning bar mitzvah, he needs to know what to do. At the age of 15, he begins to study Gemara, and at the age of 18, a person gets married. This might not be so practical nowadays, but this was the tradition in the days of Chazal, in the days of the rabbis of the Talmudic era. There is a beautiful answer offered by the Shulchan Aruch Harav as to why the Talmud, why Pirkei Avot says that a person should get married at the age of 18, and Rav Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Shulchan Aruch Harav, explains that presumably by the age of 18 a person has mastered the basics of Torah, and one of the goals of marriage is to bring children into this world and to make them into a link in our chain of tradition. And in order to make them into a link, we have to pass the Torah down to them. But we can't pass that tradition of Torah down to the next generation if we haven't mastered it ourselves. Presumably by the age of 18 we have done that, and that's why in this explanation of the various parts of Torah that we begin to study at what age, it concludes by telling us Shmona Esrei L'Chuppah, that a person gets married at the age of 18. Again, I'm not sure how practical that advice might be nowadays, but the idea is certainly a beautiful idea. The bottom line, practically, a person has to make time to study each element of the Torah Shebichtav, Torah Shebaal Peh, the Tanakh, the Mishnah, the Gemara, and certainly the Halacha. It is said in the name of Rav Avraham of Danzig, the Chaye Adam, the author of the book Chaye Adam, that the most important thing a person can learn is Halacha, is the actual prescriptions of Jewish law, because if we don't make time to learn the laws, then ultimately we won't be able to keep them. But finally, I recommend that while we try our best to learn all of these different aspects of Torah, we should certainly start anywhere that our heart desires, because ultimately, mitzvah goreret mitzvah, the rabbis tell us in Pirkei Avot, one mitzvah leads to another, and all we have to do is open the book up, start to read a little bit, and one good action, one good deed, one mitzvah, one commandment leads us to the fulfillment of another, until we become experts in all aspects of Torah. Hopefully, we should all be able to say that about ourselves, and I wish us that bracha, that we should become not just proficient, but reach mastery in all of the levels of Torah Shebichtav and Torah Shebaal Peh. Have a wonderful evening.